Good morning. This is Tracy Halesfast with Right on Four Corners. Today I'm talking with Dr. Karen Odden about her Victorian mysteries, A Dangerous Duet, and A Trace of Deceit. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning.
How is Scottsdale treating you?
It's gorgeous, actually. It's sort of 70-ish,
Nice.
A few clouds, very sunny, and it's perfect hiking weather right now.
Mm-hmm. I love Scottsdale.
Yeah.
Yes, and I also really loved your books, A Dangerous Duet and A Trace of Deceit.
Thank you.
They're intriguing and so well researched and well written.
Thank you so much. I try really hard to get the research on point, so.
Well, you've had a lot of other writings set, like intros to Victorian novels, and you've written academic papers on Victorian crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a lifestyle, right? Thinking about Victorian times for you?
Yes, I wrote my dissertation at NYU years ago now on Victorian literature, particularly Victorian railway disasters as they appeared in the novels, the medical literature, the newspapers, the poems, the songs, the cartoons. They were everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Railways were a sea change sort of in the way the Internet is a sea change for us. It changed everything. The way that people received their mail, the kind of foods they ate, how they traveled, how they thought about time and space. Most people don't know, but back in the 1820s and 30s, the continent or the island of England had 7 different time zones. They were all off by about 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Oh my!
I know. Can you imagine trying to have a railway timetable with that going on?
Wow.
So they established, it was largely due to the railways, wanted to establish a single time zone for London so they didn't have to keep worrying about the trains, crossing time zones and running into each other. So when we think about railways, they were a very powerful force there. And then I sort of got sucked into writing a dissertation about them. And then when I wrote my first book, Lady in the Smoke, I thought, well, what do I know something about that most people don't know a whole lot about? I was actually at home at the time with my son. He was, 2 maybe, when I started writing that book. And I was reading a lot of Goodnight Moon, and I think my brain was beginning to rot, which is why I started writing a novel. And I thought, well, what would happen if a young woman and her mom were in a train wreck north of London in the 1870s? And that's sort of where it began. But I had done a bunch of editing for other people. I was an assistant editor for Victorian Literature and Culture, which is an academic journal. And I had done some introductions for the Barnes & Noble editions of Victorian novels, Hard Times by Charles Dickens and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. So Victorian era, especially that 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is sort of my happy place.
In your books, we really go there, so it's quite believable.
Well, good. I'm glad that that the details work.
They work
to do that.
And in I'm not familiar with your first book, but in A Dangerous Duet and A Trace of Deceit, we see one of the same characters, the Scotland Yard detective.
Yes, Matthew Hallam.
I like him.
Yes, he's very likable.
Yes. I was just going to say, before we proceed, I think we better just give a brief synopsis of what we're talking about to our listeners.
In A Dangerous Duet, Nell Hallam is a young woman living in Mayfair, and she is a talented pianist, and she desperately wants to attend the Royal Academy of Music in Tenterden Street. And Fanny Dickens, Charles's older sister, actually was sort of a foundational character for me. She attended the Royal Academy in 1820s, but she ended up having to leave because she ran out of money. The Dickens family was notoriously sort of in and out of debt. And what she was able to go back for a little while because she was able to teach classes or offer lessons, and they let her back in. But she really couldn't pursue her musical career as fully as she would have liked. And so when I started thinking about that, I thought, well, what would Nell Hallam be able to do in the 1870s that Fanny Dickens couldn't do? And beginning in late 1840s, 1850s, music halls began to spring up all over London. They also sprung up in Manchester and Leeds and elsewhere across England. And these music halls were where all different kinds of classes could come, social classes could come and see performances. And they had everything. They had flamethrowers and trapeze artists and skits that were much more akin to sort of what you think of now maybe Saturday Night Live skits. They were tended to be very funny, sometimes very bawdy, and they had animal trainers. They had all different kinds of performers, singers, dancers, and so they needed a pianist. They needed an accompanist, and so she decides, well, if I need to earn money to go to the Royal Academy, I'll go over to Soho and I'll find a music hall that needs a pianist, and I'll work there. And, as you'd sort of suspect, men made approximately twice as much money, like 20 shillings a week as opposed to 10, which is what a woman made. So she dresses in male garb, goes over there, and gets herself a job. But in the meantime, she discovers that the music hall is also the home of a crime ring. Right. And she sort of stumbles into that and has to find her way out. So that's dangerous duet. Her brother, Matthew Hallam, just to complicate everything, is a Scotland Yard inspector who is working on investigating some crimes that are also tied to the music hall. So her two worlds begin to collide by the end of the book. And in A Trace of Deceit, Matthew Hallam reappears. Annabel Rowe is again in London in 1875, and she's a student at the Slade School of Art, which was actually founded in 1871 by a very forward-thinking philanthropist who believes that men and women should study art together. And this was a problematic idea because what are you going to do about the nudes? Mm-hmm. And but they made accommodations, and the men and women were actually in the same room when they were doing statuary, where they would sketch statues. And she has an older brother named Edwin, who is a genius and a painter. He's also a former opium addict and a forger. And he was convicted and put in jail, and he is just out of jail. He's been out of jail for about 4 months. He seems to be going straight. When she sees him, he is sober. He speaks responsibly. He shows up on time. He doesn't have the look of opium about him, and she's beginning to trust him. And then one day she goes to his flat, climbs up to the top. He has a flat up at the very top of a house, and she climbs up the stairs, and she walks in and sees these two strange men sort of flipping through his paintings and says, "Who are you? What are you doing?" They're two inspectors from Scotland Yard. One of them is Matthew Hallam, and they're there because Edwin is dead. And Annabelle is terribly upset, although not terribly surprised. She isn't sure whether this is her brother's sordid past coming back to haunt him, or if she is full of questions, and so she decides that she wants to find out what happened to him, why did he die, and who he was before he died. She needs some emotional closure. And Matthew Hallam recognizes that as Edwin's only living relative, and as someone who knows a lot about art and auctions, she's going to be useful to his investigation. So the two of them team up together, and as they explore Edwin's past, some secrets come to life. They realize they've discovered the truth of what happened.
One thing I really like about your books is that even in Victorian England, you have very strong women characters. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't easy to be a strong woman in Victorian London.
No, you had, under the system of coverture, a married woman particularly a married woman, had no access to her own money. It belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her husband. And she had no vote. She had, most of the time, no legal recourse for if anything went wrong. It was a very difficult time, and it's interesting. When I was at BoucherCon, the mystery conference in Texas recently, I was serving on a panel with 4 other women, all of whom write female characters who are trying to find some wiggle room in patriarchal society. And they do this in different ways. They take on, sort of unusual careers. They find ways to take some agency and some responsibility for their lives and some power for themselves. And the conversation got very interesting because we were all trying to find out. We're all trying to shape these female characters who have some ability to direct their own lives. Yeah.
Yes, and they're very real characters. I was pleased to meet them. Now, I have to ask you something, because so many of our listeners are writers. You got yourself with one of the big 5 publication houses.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do that?
Oh, I was lucky. So I have several books that were terrible and that they are in a drawer.
Right.
When I finally found an agent, I found my agent through Publishers Marketplace.
Great.
Which is a database. A lot of people use it. You can subscribe to it. I think it's $25 or $30 for the month. And it's a searchable database and includes all of the book deals, all of the agents, all of the publishers. And I remember typing in historical mysteries, agent, and, hitting search. And hundreds of them come up.
Oh, wow.
And the one that a friend of mine was kind of counseling me through, guiding me through this entire process, and she said, send a query letter and whatever they usually require, like 5 pages or something like that, to the first 10 or 15 agents that look like they do the kinds of things that, you write. Mm-hmm. And if they handle those kinds of books, they might be interested in yours. So I did that, and I had about 5 or 6 respond and say, we'll take a look at your first 5 or 10 pages. And then after that, I had 2 who offered representation. But this was after 2 years of rejection from agents. Lots of rejection from agents. So it only happened, once I kind of had rewritten my book, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times, and had a lot of people critique it and so forth. So when I first took the book out, it wasn't ready. And it was only later, after all the rejection and after all the rewriting and revising and everything else, that I found my agent. And then he helped me find a publisher. My first publisher was actually Random House, and it was the division Alibi, which is the ebook division. And it was with a young editor there. Her name was Priyanka Krishnan, and she really loved Elizabeth, who is my character in *In the Smoke*. Mm-hmm. Although at the time the book was called *The Viscount's Daughter*. Oh. It changed. It went through lots and lots of title changes, and so the book was published as an ebook. And then when it started selling well, they made it a company approached me and asked if they could do an audiobook. And so we had both of those going. And the nice thing about an ebook is that it's only a few dollars. And so people, I think, are willing to, say, oh, well, it's $2.99 or $1.99 or whatever it was. And they just sort of buy it on a whim. And it wasn't like investing in a hardcover book, which can be, as much as $25 or $30 now. Right. So that book ended up doing better than anybody expected. It sold over 30,000 copies.
Wow, congratulations.
So then, yeah, it was exciting. And even one of the weeks they did a promotion and it landed on the USA Today bestseller list. So that was exciting. And then when Priyanka moved from Random House over to HarperCollins and William Morrow, and I had a brand new book. Josh pitched it to her, and she really liked it. That was Dangerous Duet. And based on the strength of the Lady in the Smoke sales, she could get me a print deal with HarperCollins, so I had a 2-book deal there.
Very good.
Then, so I wrote Dangerous Duet and Trace of Deceit. In the meantime, Priyanka left for a really great, wonderful job at Hachette's, and so I received, I got a new editor at HarperCollins, and now I'm working on the next one in the series in the hopes that they will want it.
How exciting! Where are you at with that one?
I'm just beginning to draft it now. At the end of A Trace of Deceit, Celia mentions her younger sister Gwendolyn, who's a novelist,
right?
Who, as a child, didn't really want to play chess. She wanted to tell stories about the pieces, like, the bishop's in love with the queen. and so Celia, the older sister, is sort of the smart one who played chess with her father. Gwendolyn is the sort of younger, entertaining, more humorous, more social of the two. And she has become a novelist. And in this next book, her cousin and best friend, Kate, has a husband, Lewis, who has just returned from Africa, where he was on an expedition with Henry Morton Stanley. He's the Dr. Livingstone, I presume.
Mm-hmm.
Although he never actually said that. He just made that up for his book. But so her husband comes home, and he is low in his mind. He is suffering from a tropical disease. He's recuperating very slowly. But he seems to be getting better, and then one day he's dead.
Oh.
And Kate's first husband had died in sort of very suspicious circumstances. And so now she's got the second one who dies, and it turns out he's, been poisoned. And so Kate is suspected of murder. And Gwendolyn has to clear her friend's name. And this has a lot to do, I did a lot of research about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, reading things like King Leopold's Ghost and books about the ivory and slave trade in the 1870s. And the stories are harrowing. They claw at me. They still stay with me. And Lewis was a witness to a lot of it, which is why when he comes back and he plans on writing a book about it, the revelations could damage some very powerful men on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, you're not afraid to tackle big issues in these books.
Well, I guess I feel like the big ones are worth talking about.
Yeah.
And frankly, a lot of times when I come across something in my historical research, the stories that stick with me are heartbreaking and just as you'd suspect. I mean, heartbreaking and painful and surprising. I had no idea, for example, when I was reading, there's one story in particular I read when I was reading, I think it was King Leopold's Ghost, where the people who were exploiting the land for rubber would go to a tribe, for example, and they would take all of the women and children and they would stick them in cages, and then they would tell the men, you go out and bring me X number of pounds of rubber, and then we'll let your wife and your child out.
Oh, my gosh.
I know. It's like these kinds of things, and you read, I mean, how can you possibly forget that?
Right.
And then I feel like if I'm only just hearing about this, chances are a lot of other people don't know about it, and I think it's worth sort of exploring and sharing. Yeah.
And in Dangerous Duet, we have the child labor.
Yes.
And, of course, Trace of Deceit is the art scene.
Mm-hmm.
And the opium scene also. It's nothing lightweight for you.
I guess it's all rather morbid. I don't know. It was funny. The other day I was here in Scottsdale. We have a wonderful independent bookstore, Poison Pen. Have you ever been to it?
I haven't, but it's one of my goals to go there.
Oh, it's amazing. Barbara Peters, the owner, is wonderful at cultivating this community of readers and writers. She has events almost every day. She has all of these writers coming in and talking and runs workshops and all these things. But the other day I was there, and Charles Finch, who also writes Victorian mysteries, and I were talking with Barbara, and he is very good at humor. He feathers it in beautifully. There's this kind of wry, urbane, very British humor. And as I was reading his book in preparation for talking to him, I realized I don't really do funny. I'm not, these people who do humor so well, I really admire it, but my heroines are heartfelt and passionate, and they're smart, and they're talented, and they're loyal.
That's right.
But they aren't funny.
That's true.
So
that's okay.
I don't know, something maybe I need to look at.
Are you a full-time writer now?
Mostly. I still have my 15-year-old son at home. So my daughter's off to college, but he's here and he's not driving yet. So I'm still, sort of taxi service.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part-time.
Right.
But otherwise, yes, I usually am at my desk between at least 4 and 5 hours every day, writing or editing or reading somebody else's work or that kind of thing.
Well, this would be a good time for you to read something for our audience.
Okay, so A Trace of Deceit, Chapter 1. The day I lost Edwin, I think my paintbrush knew before I did. The studio was silent except for the sounds of bristles stroking against canvas, the rain splattering at the high windows, and the murmur of Mr. Pointer's instructions as he moved among the students. There was nothing to disturb me, and I should have been able to fix my attention perfectly upon the painting on my easel. But without warning, as if propelled by some contrary part of my brain, my wrist jerked, and my brush jittered across the canvas like a live thing, marring my half-finished landscape. It landed on the floor, splattering crimson paint outward in a small, delicate fan of specks like poppies dotting a field. The room fell silent. Paintbrushes paused, and for one frozen moment, all I could do was stare. A gentle cough drew my gaze to Mr. Pointer, who looked over from where he stood beside another student's easel. His gray eyebrows rose into crescents, his mouth parted between his thick mustache and fulsome beard, and then, as I fumbled something between an apology and an explanation, he shrugged and managed an understanding smile before he turned away. I laid the dirtied paintbrush in the tray and knelt to wipe up the paint with a cloth. Taking a moment to regain my equanimity, I stepped back to survey my progress and felt a pang of disappointment. In my mind was a low stone farmhouse and a weathered barn flanked by a newly plowed field, the dirt a deep, rich umber, and an absinthe green meadow edged by dusky apple trees, a scene I'd observed as a child from inside a railway carriage. The image appeared to my mind with utter clarity, down to the beveled wooden edge of the window that framed it like a picture. Usually I could transfer that clarity onto the canvas, but today it was going badly. I took a deep breath, inhaling the pungent smell of linseed oil, turpentine. Then I chose a fresh brush and began to repair the damage the errant stroke had done to my meadow. The mishap betrayed the unease that had been clawing at me all morning. Its source was no mystery. I hadn't heard from Edwin yet this week, and it brought back all too sharply the period in his life when he would vanish for a few days or even a fortnight. My parents and I would have an anxious time of it until eventually he skulked home, thin and shamefaced, every shilling gambled away or spent, his mouth sloppy from opium. Each time he'd promised to do better, but his resolution never held for long. After my parents died, it was my door he'd skulk toward, usually appearing late in the afternoon, with telltale bits of pigment on his hands and purplish shadows under his eyes, mumbling that he'd been working. I didn't inquire too closely, and it was only later I found out about the forgeries. Since being released from prison, Edwin swore he was finished with his dissolute habits and would find a way to pursue his artistic career within the law. Indeed, in the last 4 months, he had exhibited many signs of sincerity, but I had seen him earnestly repentant before. Now, at Miss Rowe, I started and nearly dropped my brush again. Geoffrey Wright, at the next easel, leaned toward me, his voice low. "Are you all right? You look awfully pale. Perhaps you belong," a faint pause as if for delicacy, "at home?" The solicitous tone was belied by the half-lowered eyelids and the disdainful set to his mouth. He was one of the men who deeply resented the presence of women at the school, although the founder, Mr. Slade, had made our inclusion a central tenet when he had established it. More than once, I'd heard Mr. Wright declaiming how the classes on anatomical drawing were all but useless because the model's loins had to be draped when women were present. Mr. Wright? Mr. Pointer's voice carried a warning. Like children chastised for a prank, we turned guiltily to look at our professor, but we saw only his back, his hands clasped behind, and his head of tidy gray hair inclined toward Miss Stokes's still life. Mr. Wright shot me a baleful look before he retreated behind his easel. I pushed aside my annoyance and worry and summoned my attention back to my canvas.
And so you have a website it's a very good website with lots of information, KarenOdden.com. And
with 2 Ds, yeah.
People can go there and find the books, and they can find lots of information. And you blog there, right?
Yes, I have my blog, and I try to write reasonably short blogs, but with illustrations that are in some way relevant to what what the books are about.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a blog on music halls, for example. I have one on auction houses, that kind of thing. So if people are curious about, for example, the Pantechnicon fire that happens in the book, which was a real fire that happened in 1874, they can read about it if they're curious. I mean, I only have 3 books out, and so I'm still a relatively new writer. And maybe if I had 20, I wouldn't feel this way, but I feel grateful for every single reader who reaches out to me and says what they liked in my books. Sometimes even, hey, I didn't like this so much in your books, or I wish this had been different, or I want to know what happened afterwards.
Oh.
I had people write in asking, so after Lady in the Smoke, what happened to Elizabeth and Paul when they left England? And I just want readers to know that I think most writers I know really appreciate them and are grateful when they engage and when they ask questions and even when they just, write in to tell us, hey, I really enjoyed your book. So I guess I would encourage not just readers of my work, but readers of anyone's works to reach out to your authors. Most people have a contact page, and to write reviews and to engage, because writing is a lonely occupation. I sit in my office alone with my beagle Rosie for hours every day, and so to hear from a reader who says, your words touched me, or I loved your character, or I learned something from your book, is tremendously gratifying.
Thank you, Karen. Again, congratulations on your award-winning and on your publications, and I look forward to the next book.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And that was Karen Odden talking about her historical fiction mystery books set in Victorian England. This is Tracy Hales-Vass with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.